Greetings from Los Angeles. I'm John Agnew. I'm sorry that I couldn't make it to the Tiergarten Conference in Berlin. In this brief video, I want to just mention some of the main points from the paper I prepared for the conference. The central theme is that since 2010, and as heralded in speeches and written documents, the U.S. administration has turned away from Europe and towards Asia as its primary geopolitical focus. Much has been made of this presumed shift by commentators in leading American magazines and in talk around Washington, D.C. My briefest possible answer to the rhetorical question in the title is no. Recent use of the word rebalancing by U.S. government officials reflects, I think, an effort to draw back from what some pundits in academia and the media had turned into a fully fledged global geopolitical reorientation. How do I reach my conclusion? First of all, a critical geopolitical perspective such as that I bring to bear is suspicious of claims about geopolitical turning points, such as the idea of a worldwide pivoting of U.S. security policy, such as some commentators have been describing. The term itself derives from classical geopolitics in the early 1900s and was always more a question of how things should be in the minds of the proposer than how they actually are. We should analyze these claims, not accept them at face value. The narrative about pivoting has two major elements. The first is about a transatlantic axis in eclipse, and the second is about a rising Asia-Pacific that is replacing the older orientation. Neither, I think, holds up to close examination. The U.S. never was simply fixed into a transatlantic posture, even at the height of the Cold War. Its alliances in Asia are long-standing. There's a clear lingering transatlantic element to U.S. security policy as well, despite the ravages of U.S. go-it-alone in Iraq. NATO is the main formal protagonist in the Afghan war that has lasted now since 2001. And I think the weakness of European Union foreign policy has kept a residual European attachment to the United States. But that aspect of U.S. security policy had begun to erode in the 1980s because of disputes with numerous European allies. The end of the Cold War also led to U.S. security policy becoming much more oriented to domestic constituencies within the United States and to economic issues rather than to the European alliance. But all of these changes date from well before the recent presumed pivoting to Asia-Pacific. In her essay about America's Pacific Century of November 2011, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton uses the phrase pivot point to describe the winding down of wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the need to pay renewed attention to Asia-Pacific. But there's no mention of Europe or the transatlantic world. Indeed, much of the essay is taken up with extolling the positives in the U.S.-Europe relationship while also addressing the rising economic and political significance of Asia for the United States. Since writing this piece, Secretary Clinton has tended to focus more on China and less on Asia as a whole, and has adopted a more negative tone than was the case previously. Some of this, I think, probably reflects the electoral cycle in the United States, where bashing China has become the order of the day. Along with the Pentagon's publication of a purportedly new strategy towards Asia, although it's not really new at all, this focus on the so-called Chinese threat lends credibility to the pivoting narrative. I would suggest, however, that a less dramatic interpretation is in order. Hyperbole has long characterized popular American views of China, from the open door policy of the late 19th century to the hubris over which Americans single-handedly lost China to the communists in 1949, and current rhetoric about China's mercantilism. As yet, the U.S. government has not moved any military assets to speak of from Europe to Asia. China has long been contained by the United States by a chain of bases in East Asia. Chinese naval assets are also minuscule compared to those the U.S. can already bring to bear. Finally, the Chinese government is much more complicated internally than the typical totalitarian interpretations that emanate from Washington. In a recent research article, I've pointed out that there are serious disputes in China over foreign policy. It is misleading to portray China in singular terms. Flowing through the entire narrative about pivoting, are a number of what I would call blind spots. The first of these is the appeal of totalistic turning points, the idea that there are these pivots around which security policy moves from one period of time to another. In fact, I would argue that these are extremely rare, and we're certainly not in the presence of one of these, either rhetorically in the case of the Obama administration or actually on the ground. Secondly, global cultural and economic instability, I think, has encouraged a burgeoning community of what could be called geopolitical seers, who think very much in macro terms about the world as a whole, but are often not well informed by local knowledge and are tempted, in a sense, to always look for dramatic shifts from one part of the world to another. A third blind spot is the hubris that world politics is driven only by great powers. And I think we're all very well aware that in many ways in East Asia specifically, often smaller countries, I think of North Korea, have in fact had a whole lot of influence over the direction of security policy. Fourthly, I would draw attention to what I think is the relative incoherence of the term Asia-Pacific in terms of defining some kind of homogeneous region. How does this differ from, for example, use of the term Pacific Rim? One use, of course, is to tie the United States across the Pacific to Asia. But it's a term, in fact, that's come into common currency recently, but which doesn't have much of a tradition associated with it. And then finally, I would draw attention to the real difficulty of incorporating China easily into traditional thinking about international relations, when it had long been the byword for stagnation and despotism, and seen without much of a future in the modern world. It's still hard to fit China into the nation-state realist and liberal paradigms that dominate Western thinking, and we need to examine these sorts of assumptions that we make very carefully. What then are the implications of this overall critical geopolitical approach for thinking about contemporary U.S. security policy? Well, the first of these, I think, is that the United States is not a singular superpower, but is faced with a complex array of actors, both political and business-related, who are often pushing in quite different directions from that of the United States. Secondly, the world has been undergoing a long-term transformation, not just some sudden shift from a simply territorial to a more city-centered and less territorialized world. This is most obvious in monetary and financial affairs, but is apparent also in other sectors as well. Thirdly, foreign policy rhetoric is increasingly hostage to domestic constituencies of one sort or another, whether that be in China with differences between the military and the party, or in the United States between various pressure groups, often emanating from different immigrant constituencies of one sort or another. And finally, fourthly, in many ways, geopolitical arguments rely on defining national identity very much in terms of others who are seen as somehow less civilized or more backward than we are. And this kind of logic has often been the one that's been used between the United States on the one hand and Asia on the other. And this still has a payoff in popular political discourse within the United States, but has less and less to do with how the world actually works economically and culturally, when global elites of one kind or another now make much more of the running than in the past. By way of conclusion, I'd like to show a cartoon that appeared in a recent issue of the London Financial Times, which is a caricature of the speech given by the actor Clint Eastwood at the Republican National Convention several weeks ago in Tampa, Florida. And what it shows, of course, is this idea that Mr. Eastwood was talking to an empty chair, which was the symbolic of the Obama administration, and perhaps, as the protagonist in any number of spaghetti westerns and crime shows, Mr. Eastwood was drawing attention to the lack of any kind of dramatic policy changes associated with the Obama administration, hence the symbolism of the empty chair. And from my point of view, this of course doesn't mean that there's been no policy established by the Obama administration. It's just that it's a policy that's based on a much more nuanced and worldwide sort of rebalancing rather than this kind of totalistic, hubristic repivoting of the narrative that has recently become so popular. Thank you.